Salutations everybody, it is Matty here today. Hope you're all doing absolutely fantastic. Today we are gathering to talk about South of Midnight. South of Midnight is out right now if you pay for the early access premium edition, which is $10 through Game Pass. Otherwise, you're going to wait till April 8th. You can get it on Game Pass day one, or you can pay a full 40 bones for it. I've got two words for you to describe South of Midnight. It is repetitive. It is also heartfelt. It's a very weird line to walk, I understand, but I aim to break it all down for you. Ultimately, I enjoyed my time enough with South of Midnight to recommend it. At a full price, not quite. But when it comes to a Game Pass game or some sort of flavor of the week pickup, sure, I just think this game could have been much more than that. But those two words will be a through line for this entire review. Everything from the music and performances to the unique southern locales, stop motion animation, and brilliant lighting give this game a distinct look and feel. South of Midnight is like looking at a painting on your phone versus one in a museum. You'll stop, admire, gawk even, but then carry on afterwards. It leaves a lasting impression visually where you may always remember that image in your head, but it's not quite like seeing it in person where you establish the real connection with the artist and what they were feeling when they crafted that piece. I'll always remember South of Midnight because of how it looks, but unlike the films that inspired its visuals, such as Coraline or Nightmare Before Christmas, its story and characters sadly fall to the wayside for me when the experience could have been much more impactful or even long-lasting. This is mostly due to strange pacing and faulty execution of its finale, as I'll break down in a little. Now, in spite of all of this, I still do have a lot of love for South of Midnight. It may boil down to a snapshot in my brain rather than an experience, but that snapshot is still worth something. When not hampered by textures loading in, which happened often on my Xbox Series X playthrough, Compulsion has made a world that I honestly just loved being in as an animation fan. The stop motion just does so much for this game in a sea of titles that look generic and similar. It's an absolute showcase in how great lighting can make your game go from good to great in the looks department. And paired with some truly incredible audio design and embracing the culture that it's based upon, South of Midnight does have its moments where it just punches you in the face with impact. I just wish it could have been a little more hard. To be frank with you, I'm caught a little bit off guard about this aspect of South of Midnight because this does come from Compulsion Games, developers of games like We Happy Few and creators of the very underrated Contrast. So that's actually my first PS4 game, might I add. South of Midnight tries to fit itself into the same pocket as Contrast, I would say, that being a more tight-knit game. Now, short games, especially nowadays, I don't even think I need to break it down, but of course they sound more appealing because, oh my god, I won't have to take a month to finish this whole thing. That's fantastic, right? But for me, more than anything, especially as someone who does this for a job, it's exciting to see a short game because it usually is an indication that a team knows exactly what they want to say. They have a very strong idea of it at the very least. And games with something to say are 100% my jam, as everyone knows. South of Midnight is an entire game about healing the wounds of our past. This is something that really interested me, especially as an adult. I'm like, okay, we all have things that have hurt us growing up. I'm curious to see how they explore it. But what surprised me so much is as you get deeper into the story, you start to recognize how much of the execution in both its biggest and smallest moments was really missed. So let's get into the basics. I'll keep it spoiler free as always, especially given that this game only has so much to give, so I don't want to get too deep into it. But you play as Hazel Flood, a weaver capable of mending those aforementioned emotional wounds. However, Hazel doesn't really start off that way. She's just a kid who's packing her things in the middle of a hurricane. Now, when her house, along with her mom, is washed away following an argument that breaks out between the two, Hazel ventures out to find her mother, with regret weighing heavily on her heart. Now, as you explore the American Deep South, you'll find many troubled people, creatures, all that good stuff that you need to help out. And much like Hazel, these creatures are all carrying their own problems that you have to help solve. But I felt like I could barely get attached to anyone given how much they drop in and out of the game so rapidly. And what unfortunately punches that aspect home is how formulaic the approach to these characters are. They all have distinct, unique stories to tell, but the way they deliver it is so samey time and time again that it does take a lot away from that potential narrative experience. What I mean by this is you're dropped into a new chapter, you fight a group of bad guys, you bottle up some traumatic memories of a character you met maybe like 10, 15 minutes ago, you do that 3 more times, you run away from some fog and a little 3D platforming, you reach a tree, you get to the conclusion of that arc, you understand everything that character's been to and what led them here, and then the level ends maybe with a boss fight. Many of these characters, however, you will never see again, and I often found myself asking why I'd even care about them since you spend so little time getting to know them where a connection just cannot be formed even for the most optimistic of gamers. It's great the first or second time around, you kind of just love the vibe of it, but the fifth or sixth time, it was just wearing me out where I felt like I could only enjoy this game in bursts. In a way, I want to describe these moments as side quests, but since it's all mandatory, it feels a touch more like fluff would be the best descriptor. And this repetition would be fine, but the game kind of proves me right when the two characters that they do choose to lean into and revolve in and out of the story consistently happen to be their strongest and most interesting before they're unfortunately cut off with what I found to be a pretty abrupt ending. So Hazel Flood's growth as a character from immature kid who feels neglected to professional weaver with a better understanding of life itself is tangible enough, but the igniting moment of the plot alongside the resolution both just felt a little bit unsatisfactory to me. Now it's time for everybody's favorite game, comparisons. Oh boy, I'm doing it. Kena, Bridge of Spirits. Interestingly, these two games could not be more parallel in my eyes in what they're both trying to do and the same challenges they faced in design to accomplish what they were setting out to do. In Kena Bridge of Spirits, you're trying to move characters who are in this world into the afterlife. And across these three arcs in Kena, you know that there isn't permanence to almost any single person in this world, which puts the game in an uphill battle narratively. Like, why care when they're going to go away sometime soon? Yet, many, myself included, found themselves caring because the game committed itself to a group that they build up and then rip away from you in a beautiful way that felt as if the journey was complete. Again, does that sound familiar? South of Midnight faces a similar challenge. Hey, you're only going to be with this crew for a very tight window. How do we make it count? So what South of Midnight opts to do is tell brief vignettes of these characters scattered throughout the Deep South on your way to finding your mother, and sometimes they just don't feel relevant or important to the plot at all. And if this was a game that offered optional content, I do think this would be totally fine, but that's not the case here. This is a game that tries to be all killer, no filler. Like, it's a very linear game. You're always running down a pretty straight and narrow path to your next location. There's moments where the game briefly breaks open a little bit to kind of pick how you want to go about your quest, but most times it is just shoving you down that path, and everything you do is pretty much mandatory outside of going off the trail to maybe collect a little bit of that currency to level up. But otherwise, South of Midnight is almost entirely on rails, for a lack of better word. So for a game thrusting you forward so often, I'm just surprised that the collective experience isn't more heavily directed. So ultimately, South of Midnight's narrative isn't a complete flop, but it definitely left a ton of its potential on the table, especially with its ending, which just felt so rushed, which I just didn't get. I'm like, why'd you spend so much time with all these side characters that I would never really see again when you could have just spent more time putting a bow on this story, which was, I just thought, on track to wrap up in an interesting way. And it's just like, we'll see you in the next one, y'all. My guess, given this is a brand new first-party studio from Xbox that was bought many years ago, is, building up the asset library, picking a direction, going in that direction, changing directions as many games in development do. I'm just guessing, but that's the vibe I kind of got here. Now, despite these kinds of frustrations, I did have a good enough time romping through the American Deep South, if only to hear another incredible piece of music. It may be disjointed at times, but you can feel tons of walks of life throughout this game, even if at times it's just difficult to fully connect with on the level I was hoping to. While people use Game Pass game as a pretty derogatory term, I do think this is the type of stuff we can get out of Game Pass. And in that light, I just hope that Xbox does see what's here, kind of like maybe what they're doing with Hellblade, and find some value in just investing in these types of games. Because while I'm excited for something such as a Fable, a big open world game, I am also hoping that we continue to get these types of experiences, even if they don't always fully nail everything. Some of the previously mentioned repetition is thanks to that narrative structure, but now I want to focus on the game's combat because a lot of the problems do lie there. Now, South of Midnight hosts a basic combat system that can absolutely get the job done, but don't go in expecting incredible boss fights or deep combo crafting. I think just by one look at the game, that's not where many people's expectations were at. Mine certainly weren't there, but it's so simple that even the littlest ideas you might have of like where this combat could go are kind of squashed out pretty immediately. You have a basic attack button alongside a suite of 4 abilities. One strand allows you to push, another allows you to pull. Depending on the size of the enemy, you may pull yourself to them and do an aerial attack thanks to an upgrade. You can tie down an enemy with a strand to leave them open for a beatdown, or you can use Crouton, your kind of like childhood doll, to possess enemies to fight on your behalf. You can also use Crouton to get around certain parts of the level where you're gonna like run around these prickly bushes and mushrooms that blow up, and I mean the game just uses this everywhere, whether you are Crouton or not. But sometimes you'll be this little guy and you'll just go through not even platforming sections, just areas you run around in, and you'll interact with an object and it'll remove some of the mess that's around you to allow you to progress the level further. But the main way he's used in combat is just through possessing your enemies. Like I mentioned earlier, you can upgrade each of these abilities in a small tree from a currency that you collect by exploring tiny hidden parts of the level. But about 90% of the memories you'll earn is the same mindless mashing of attacks over and over. And I can already hear the defense force stepping in and being like, well, that's not what the game's going for, bro. It leans on its combat heavily, to the point where the combat needed to be better rather than just an afterthought. Like, I'm a perfect example because I particularly did not care about this at first because I'm here for vibes and storytelling and good music, and I was getting a lot of that early on. But again, I feel like the team at Compulsion left a little on the table here too. Like, why is it that I can only hit enemies for so long before they do an attack where their health bar turns yellow and I can't interrupt them? Why is it when I'm unraveling enemies that it has to break the flow of combat by pulling the camera in? There's nothing I can do that just maintains that rhythm. Why is it that all of these abilities that you do have not been tailored to unique enemies that the game throws my way? There are enemies that sometimes put shields on other enemies. There are enemies that'll shoot bugs at you. There are enemies that are huge and hulking. And I feel like you just have a bunch of different archetypes here that, while simple, you could have used the abilities that we have as a player to make these encounters a little bit more unique. But all the enemies that are thrown at you are beaten the same way. Mashing the X button and waiting for that uninterruptible attack to kick in, dodging away, and diving back in. To be clear, because we're in a world of no nuance and misunderstandings, I don't want Devil May Cry. I just want them to embrace the core principles in both combat and narratively that the game was built upon to the highest degree before, shifting their gaze elsewhere. So naturally, I will stick with Kena as an example because the two are very parallel in this area as well. I could be wrong, but I feel like Compulsion really studied this game carefully as they were making their own. But anyway, Kena's combat system is simple too. You have a light attack, a heavy attack, dodging, blocking, and shooting out a couple of abilities. There's a couple more buttons to press compared to South of Midnight, but not enough to say these two are just drastically different in the gameplay department. Yet Kena manages to hook you with its enemy variety, but that variety is only felt because I may need to use my heavy attack to, say, break the shield of an enemy, or my bow to open up an enemy for damage. None of this is revolutionary, mind you, but it works extremely well because it pulls the maximum potential out of what currently exists before going on to make new mechanics. So even if you remove Kena from the situation, South of Midnight doesn't make use of these abilities in fun and creative ways. Like, pushing enemies doesn't matter. All it does is stagger them. But what if pushing enemies knocked them into the thorns on the wall and that did more damage? What if pulling enemies yanked the shield off of them when they tried to do the uninterruptible attack? Just little things like that on the combat design could have done so much more, I think. And this would be fine if it was something that we did every so often, but it is just extremely frequent that you're going to be fighting in this game. But this is where I think faulty game design sort of exposes itself a little bit. You have a game that does a lot of combat, but it doesn't need to do a lot of combat when it has great platforming fundamentals. It doesn't need to do a lot of combat when it has puzzle fundamentals. And the game, again, kind of proves me right because there are chapters like chapter 9 where you feel like the team has a collective aha moment. They're like, this is how we can do the game. And you see moments throughout where it's light puzzles and platforming, and there was like no combat for like 20 or 30 minutes. I'm like, this is a good flow right now. Like, I'm learning more about the world. I'm putting things together. It doesn't feel overly AAA. It feels very indie. Like, this is a good rhythm. And then I got into a fight at the end of that level. I was like, okay, cool. And this is a nice boss fight. And there I was like, okay, they're going to turn it up a gear. But then it dips back down into that same routine. It's not until like chapter 12, I feel they come up for air again. They're like, oh, we can do this in our levels too. Like, we never really thought about that until now, so let's just squeeze that in here. And so unfortunately, they become these moments, these pockets in the game of like, oh, this is what it could be, like this good balance of all three things you're doing. But instead, they just really default to the combat super heavily for like the first 10 chapters of the game. The platforming in South of Midnight allows you to wall run, double jump, and air dash yet it rarely combines those elements for something fun, butt clutching, or interesting. The escape sequences are a great example here because you're always going to be running away from this fog after you collect the final memory in that level. And it seems like it's pretty inspired by Ori and the Blind Forest, where after a segment in that game, you'd have this pixel perfect 2D platforming that was really tough as you attempted to outrun your environment. Now, South of Midnight attempts to capture a similar element, but all you see are these like lined walls that are telling you like, hey gamer, you can wall run here, and then you'll double jump and you'll glide for like 1 second, and there's no like hazards in the platforming that might obstruct you outside of these prickly bushes, which you just run by. So it just could be so much more engaging. It's enough to get the job done, but it just could be so much more engaging when they do that at the end of almost every level. That's where the tedium sets in, despite it being a game that is relatively short compared to many coming out nowadays. So South of Midnight is a perfectly fine Game Pass game, or if you want to pay $10 for the early access, like, go right ahead. I don't think it'll be a waste of time at all. I just wish this was a game I could champion for you to go spend your full $40 on. It's rare that we get big first-party games that are trying to do the things that South of Midnight is doing, so I was like cheering for the home run here. I just wish it was more than the weekend romp, the flavor of the week. I think the game could be so much more than that. And maybe to you, it will be. I felt I connected really well with the vibes, the culture, the music, the things that really made this game, the visuals, stand out immediately. But it's kind of what's holding it all down is really like an anvil at the end of the day. Like the combat, the core things that make it a video game kind of take away from South of Midnight. And I think it's just down to basic design at that point, because it has a simple feature set, but the way they utilize it could have been so much better and created an experience that breathed a little, developed characters a little bit better, was more fun to play. So South of Midnight is an all right time. Like I said, it's heartfelt. You can see the passion is here. You know Compulsion tried. This was not phoned in. But unfortunately, it's also dragged down by repetition. So I don't regret my time with it, but I just wish I could be sitting here telling you just how amazing it is, other than a laundry list of other issues I had. So that's my review on South of Midnight. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Are you still picking this one up? Let me know. Go check out some other reviewers while you're at it, and I will catch you in the next video. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.